Part 1. Progression and what defines Metroid. At its core, Super Metroid is just a bare-bones action game. Combat-wise, Samus can shoot lasers and missiles in 8 directions via some rather unwieldy controls, and that's about it. When it comes to movement and its applications, however, we start to enter a whole new world. There's the usual stuff, walking, jumping, and morphing into a ball to get through tighter passages. Then you get to this bridge, affectionately christened the Noob Bridge by the game's fans, because it checks whether you ever bothered to press the Y button on it. And if you have, then you know that you can run and get longer reaching jumps. Then you may realize that the morph bombs launch Samus upward and that you can place these bombs in mid-air. So maybe you can chain bomb jumps together to go really high and, after hours upon hours of practice, side to side. Then you might notice that Samus's character model sort of changes when she skims the surface of a wall, but only when jumping to the side while walking or running, not directly upwards. And it looks as if she's leaning on it to gather strength or something. And once you time your button press correctly while that's happening, you realize that you can do an honest-to-God wall jump, although it's gonna take a while till you can do 2 successive ones. Besides, even if you didn't notice the wall jump prep animation, the animals do a great job of teaching you, along with shine sparking, which, if you experiment with it, you may find that you can do upwards, sideways, or even diagonal. Super Metroid isn't just a game in which you explore and uncover a hostile planet and its contents. It's a game which you explore and uncover as it progresses. The progression through the game world is mirrored in the progression of the player's skill set, along with their effectiveness in utilizing that set of skills. And the elegance and subtlety through which this dynamic is implemented into a game in which you run, jump, and shoot in 8 directions is nothing short of magical. What's more, this progression is seemingly endless. Though it is by all means a single-player experience with a clear path that most players are likely to traverse in the same way in their first playthrough, the skill ceiling for Super Metroid is incredibly high. Just taking a look at the speedrunning categories is enough to say all there is to say about its liberating approach to player, not character, but player progression. These categories exist because the devs didn't put an artificial cap on the player's skill, like so many other games do for the sake of making development and design easier. They trusted their players to get as comfortable with the controls, mechanics, and level design as they would and could, instead of employing those elements as limiting reagents to better pace a would-be linear experience. Pacing as a concept is largely moot in a well-designed exploration game, because if you did a good enough job spreading out the major encounters, implementing some linear environmental build-up rooms, making the encounters cathartic as all get out, and crucially, making exploration intrinsically enjoyable and rewarding, then the game basically paces itself, whatever path the player might choose to forge for themselves. This approach to, or departure from, pacing also speaks to the game design's overarching theme and philosophy of progression. Not the games. The game itself has different themes that we'll talk about later on in part 3. This mindset is ultimately what defines Metroid and the genre it helped give rise to, and it's why Super Metroid arguably still stands at the top more than 2 decades later. More of the world is uncovered as you find items and upgrades to unlock new sections, and this is the most important part, even more is made available for traversal once you get more skilled at and apply more of your imagination in utilizing them. Not to diss them or anything, since every game plays to different strengths, but most other Metroidvanias aren't this crafty and open-ended with their upgrades and exploration. Instead, possessing a binary, if you have this upgrade you can progress, and having it is the only requirement, and you can't progress if you don't have it, design philosophy, which is largely why Super Metroid Planet Zephyr is, to this day, one of the most satisfying worlds to really sink your teeth into and thoroughly discover. Of course, that's not the only satisfying thing about Super Metroid. The combat is immensely enjoyable to partake in, with the octagonal aiming adding a few layers of strategy in terms of positioning and angling your shots. Each missile and plasma beam landing on an enemy is crunchy and weighty thanks to the getting hit animations, as well as the light flashing and explosion effects. The beam upgrades throughout the game also do a great job of subtly but regularly empowering the player and streamlining the fighting, so the players can focus more intently on the good part, being exploration. However, that's where I run out of things to say about the combat, because it really is all about the exploration, and the means through which we explore, being movement. And the movement is special not only for all the things we already discussed, but also for the result of everything we discussed. The movement is so deep and complex that Super Metroid is one of the very first video games ever to allow for mechanical reflex-based player expression. Years before games like Quake 3, Super Smash Bros. Melee, and Team Fortress 2 implemented such skill-intensive systems, whether intentionally or not, for fast, frantic, competitive multiplayer experiences, more so in the vein of Street Fighter, Super Metroid was letting players choose a style of play molded by the jumps they would do, the divergences they'd take, and the sequences they'd break. Even something as simple as Samus's jump arc speaks to how hard the game stuck to its vision of a skill-based movement system. If you jump while moving at a reasonable pace, Samus will jump diagonally, and and changing direction in the air will make it so that she now moves in the opposite direction, making the exact same angle with the ground, so that space jumping and wall jumping are more predictable, organized into easily identifiable diagonal patterns, and overall more intricate and skill intensive. However, all this ingenuity wasn't enough for Nintendo R&D, so they made sure that one of the most intricate movement systems ever was complemented by one of the most intricately designed worlds as well. Part 2. The Game Design Gospel. Do you remember the room before you get the speed booster upgrade? It slowly fills with lava, so you have to run through it, and once you get the speed boost you start running again, and by running you activate the speed boost and voila, you have learned how to use a new upgrade. And how the door you enter right after you get the gravity suit has no ground near it, so you have to fall down into the water below and realize that you're sinking and walking inside the water at the same speed you would fall and walk outside of it. What about that ice beam section? You start climbing up and notice some crawly enemies coming out of the wall to the right. Then you look for the source, do some mothball gymnastics, and the upgrade is right there. So then you kill the crawlies, but they get frozen first, just to show you that that's what happens. Drop down, quickly climb back up, and now you have some learning to do. Learning how the ice beam works, how it can freeze enemies and in doing so, allow you to reach previously inaccessible areas and doors. Now all that remains is to roll through the tube that goes over the room before the whole ice beam gauntlet and fall down through a seamless breakable block. Lastly, there's this part, which not a lot of people are bound to really notice, but it, being completely honest, made me remove my hands from the controller and throw them up in amazement and disbelief. You initially enter this room from the right, and you have to break all the blocks individually to get through to the left. Once you're done with the area and head into this room to get back, you take a deep sigh and start putting morph bombs down again, presumably pushing the right button on the D-pad in your impatience. Then all of a sudden, you get shot up due to the bomb's knockback and unwittingly put into a shortcut tunnel that dispenses you all the way on the left side. As far as the deceptively simple yet elegant brilliance of game design goes, Super Metroid is yet to be outdone 25 years later. Whether through rigorous playtesting, ingenious design work, or a healthy combination of the two, these little tricks may seem not that big a deal, or maybe even as a one-off set-piece gimmick in each case, but the fact is that whether you notice them or not, they make the game more tight, more consistent, and overall more enjoyable. They cut down on backtracking, they tie the end of a section to the beginning of the same section, they allow you to take different paths each time you arrive at them, they are anything but a gimmick or a small deal. For any designer, this game's approach to the construction of its world, its traversal mechanics and the ways these two interlink and complement each other should be treated and studied, as the section title suggests, like gospel, because Super Metroid is a fathomless goldmine of libertarian, intuitive and, I say again, elegant game design. Now, why does this matter? This whole section may sound like an overly objective, overly technically minded, surface-level analysis of the game's design that doesn't contribute to the conversation about what it's really about and why it's significant to the medium. So let me assure you that the reason I took so much time listing what may seem like design quirks, ultimately insignificant to the game's overall artistic composition, and therefore this anatomy, is that a game's approach to designing its levels, not what levels it designs and what it conveys through them, but why and how it designs them the way it does, is absolutely crucial in reaching a conclusion on what the game's intent and purpose are. Sure, Super Metroid first and foremost strives to be a good action game, but there are as many ways to do that as there are action games. Why did Super Metroid take this route of crafting a carefully and tightly knitted world, even though this is perhaps the most laborious and difficult way of doing it? Part 3. Help from Isolation. Super Metroid's ultimate and overall intent seems to be to craft an experience of being a hero who overcomes inhuman evils, trials and tribulations. Standard stuff so far. However, it wisely recognizes that no hero achieves such great deeds without one particular external factor, and builds its design, atmosphere and narrative around the necessity of that one factor: help. Everything Samus does in this game, she does either through or for simple assistance. In this way, Super Metroid is one of the more unique and, dare I say, realistic power fantasies in gaming. While The Legend of Zelda also contextualized its divine help by framing it as having been put where he'd need them most from ancient goddesses, it simply uses this framing device as, well, a framing device. It's there mainly to explain away some improbable design decisions and increase suspension of disbelief and verisimilitude in order to create immersion. The fact that it fits into the supernatural aid trope from heroic stories is also a fortunate aspect of it. Super Metroid, however, takes a good hard look at those design decisions, identifies the necessity of explaining them through in-world entities, and then goes on to identify that need as the thing most worthy of being expanded upon. Super Metroid may sell itself as a game about overcoming challenges all by yourself, with the ambient music and withered alien visuals cultivating an inarguable air of isolation and looming danger, but these end up being the perfect tools to underline the moments throughout the game wherein you simply cannot persevere on your own. In fact, one is likely to figure out that they've been put through a sort of arc, one in which they started out feeling alone and with nobody to trust, but only reaching the end with outside support. The game's movement system and level design may empower the player to heroic proportions, and the environments may be isolated and hostile, and Samus may be a lone wolf bounty hunter, but the game's progression makes it clear that you didn't do all that by yourself. Let's break down the many ways in which the game turns from a lone adventure into a tale of external aid, and keeps up a sense of heroic inadequacy alive throughout its duration. At the very start, in two locations where the morph ball upgrade and a missile upgrade are, Samus unwittingly activates some kind of security camera-like device, conveying the sense of an awakened, oncoming danger. The enemies aren't very tough and easily dispatched until the first boss you're likely to face throws you for a loop. One of the Chozo statues that have been providing you with upgrades comes alive and tries to rip you to shreds. At that moment, the player is likely to believe that they can trust nobody, not even the statues. The game is filled with areas that remain inaccessible until you get a particular upgrade. Being conscious of the themes of help and not being able to do things all on your own, these areas seem no longer as purely utilitarian level gates. They force you to give up and change course, so that once you're prepared, meaning once you've gotten the upgrades, aka enough help, you can try and brave them again. But for now, you can't do anything about them. You'll just have to stress out about remembering where they were and hope you can find an upgrade soon enough that you don't forget. The upgrades may be the most important of the game's motifs. They're the result of divine help, represented by these statuesque robot bird things, being the aforementioned Chozos, as well as each of them an opportunity for the player to prove that they're worthy of their help. The Chozo's prophecy is obviously alluded to your quest to Zebes, so they place these upgrades at the points where they'd be needed the most, not given at the very start or with ease, but in places where you'd have to really work for them, and even set up rooms where you can learn how to most effectively utilize them. So the fact that you have to fight another one of these birds near the end is quite thematically appropriate. Up to that point, you'd likely forgotten about the first boss fight and given into the comforting loop of finding upgrades within their claws and looking for the next one. They'd been synonymous with safety and security, so having yet another one try to kill you this far into your isolated journey, instead of making you give up your trust to all things around you again, has the effect of making you wish for a dependable helping hand. You've seen enough of the level designs and boss fights, and gotten enough of the upgrades now, that you know better than to think that you can just say whatever and go off on your own. Speaking of, the boss fights rarely require any movement tricks, so all the skill you've accumulated through traversing the planet is futile during these events. You simply have to beat the enemy down while trying to survive long enough to deal enough blows. Super Metroid's boss fights never really feel easy or empowering. They instead feel like frantic struggles to outlive the enemy like Ridley, careful attempts to apply the winning strategy like Crocomire, or an amalgamation of both like Kraid. These fights are a far cry from the Zelda approach of you have the item, just use it, because unlike Super Metroid, Zelda doesn't ever want to undermine your heroism. If anything, they're closer to Souls bosses. Maybe not as hard, but with the same sense of struggling to overcome a great obstacle. Even unlike those, however, Super Metroid doesn't dwell much on the triumph. It tricks you into thinking you're not done yet, gives you a gruesome and unnerving death scene, hits you immediately with new challenges and makes you start to panic again, because the Metroid has already escaped its container. Throughout the length of the game, these subtle, nearly invisible subconscious conditioners, and some visible ones like the animals helping you by teaching you new tricks, and you optionally saving them, build up a sense of, to use the word a few times more, inadequacy. A skillful inadequacy, but inadequacy nonetheless. Through what might be a controversial way of looking at it, I suspect that the knowledge that Samus is a woman might unfortunately contribute to this feeling. I hope and would like to believe that this isn't true, but with our cultures being the way they are, I don't think that it can be discounted. Regardless, these bottled up feelings of desiring help, along with the theme of needing help, narratively and mechanically culminate in the final boss fight, when the escaped Metroid, who earlier recognized you as its savior and mother, and its helper if you will, drains Mother Brain's energy and uploads it into Samus, and at that point it becomes abundantly clear that there is no way Samus could have done all this by herself. In this way, Super Metroid strikes a delicate balance. It manages to present a full-on action-packed power fantasy, while subtly working in design and narrative elements that undermine that heroism by just the right amount, so that the game doesn't forego higher artistic ambitions for the sake of a thrill ride, and its chosen theme is conveyed in the most effective way, subconsciously. Sure, when asked what Super Metroid's theme is, most players aren't likely to say help, but it's only due to this dedication of keeping it on a subconscious level, and avoiding text and dialogue to convey it directly aside from the intro. The game's objective isn't to get you thinking about helplessness or the need for aid, it's to make you feel helpless and in need of aid in a way unique to video games. We may not necessarily be able to articulate it or even conclude it, but we all feel what the game makes us feel in each moment. And with how skillfully all these feelings are evoked by the game, we feel it down to our very core. No matter how good you are, and you are good, we all need an occasional helping hand. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you in a couple of weeks when I talk about a beloved Western RPG. Have a good day.